Hi everyone, welcome to the video lecture for Chapter 10. Here we're going to be talking about monopoly power and the firm's pricing decisions. And so if we follow along in the slides here, what's happening is that we want to first explore kind of the origins of a monopoly, and this is something that we've discussed previously in class. But when we talk about a monopoly, we say that this is a pure monopoly in a sense that there's only one producer of this good, essentially no close substitutes being produced by almost any other firm. And I think those are really important for us to understand. Since the firm essentially is the industry, they have the control over the price, essentially that is charged for their good. This is very dissimilar to perfect competition, where the industry dictated the price for the firm. Now, monopolies essentially are created and they are sustained due to very, very strong entry barriers, which make it very difficult for new firms to enter the industry. And that's something that we'll talk about here in terms of blocking potential, maintaining that monopoly. What does that mean for us? And then when we talk a little bit about this idea of non-price competition, mostly we see some sort of public relations or advertising, which is their only means of non-price competition. Since there's no rival firms, we're going to see very little non-price competition, suggesting why we're better than another firm. And this would be very different from a monopolistically competitive standpoint. Suppose, for example, we're in the industry of athletic apparel. Clearly, there's lots of non-price competition between Under Armour, Reebok, Nike, Adidas. So as we kind of move on here in the slides, we're talking a little bit about, well, how does a monopoly stay a monopoly, or how does it become a monopoly to begin with? And the first that we talk about is the idea of economies of scale. This is a really major barrier to enter. Essentially what we see happening, and we know what economies of scales are, but we see this occurring because per unit cost, monopolies might have the lowest cost, and this ends up being the lowest unit price for essentially production. So lowest unit price for consumers depend on the existence maybe of a small firm or large firms, or in the case maybe of a pure monopoly only in one firm. Because a very large firm with a large market share is most efficient with economies of scale, new firms can't afford essentially the startup in those industries that have the economies of scale. So we could potentially see only one firm emerge. These tend to be due to the large fixed costs that come about here. So one of the examples that we tend to point to are public utilities. These are oftentimes cited as natural monopolies because of their extreme economies of scale in those instances, right? They are generally the only firm in the market because of the high fixed cost, which is, again, that a very important barrier to entry. And this is exactly what we talked about in class with our ISP providers. And in these instances, the government usually steps in, and we'll talk more about the role of the government. But just to begin, the government steps in, usually giving the one firm the right to essentially operate a public utility industry. But in exchange, the government gets to regulate the kind of market power. And we see this with electric generation. We see this with water. And so outside of economies of scale, there are other legal barriers that kind of create this monopoly setting. One of them is patents. Essentially, patents and this license allows a firm or an inventor exclusive rights to produce or lease or license a product for a variety of time. Maybe these exclusive rights earn profit for future research, which again in turn results in more patents, and then again, which in turn allows for more monopoly profits. And this patent or right to produce or license to produce is really important, especially in the pharmaceutical industry. Again, in class, we were able to go through a real-world scenario where a CEO of a firm essentially was able to understand that that being kind of the only producer in a market allows you to have some sort of market power. And we saw that the increase per price of per consumption of this drug went from $13.50 to over $750 per pill. So licenses, again, in conjunction with patents, are very powerful, and they're this kind of other form of entry barrier. So radio and TV stations are really important for that. Not just anyone can essentially go. You need to be regulated and the content as well. What I think is interesting is now we generally cite taxi companies having essentially going through government regulation to grant licenses where maybe only one or two firms are allowed to offer their service. And now we're seeing a strong deviation away from that with the implementing of things like Uber and Lyft, which again, we are essentially discussing in class with our first or second mover advantage in this case scenario. Another kind of barrier to entry, so to speak, then, is specific ownership or control of an essential resource. Now, I think this is a very important one. We can cite a few different kind of examples of this in the real world. There's an international nickel company called Inco that used to essentially control about 90% of the world's nickel reserves, which had a very clear monopoly in the nickel market and any other alloy that depended on nickel. And De Beers of South Africa is another really interesting example that controls most of the world's diamond supplies. And essentially, we understand that diamonds in this instance are not necessarily a scarce resource. They're actually a very plentiful resource. It's just that the control of the supply of diamonds is so tight through De Beers that we're able to see some sort of monopoly type per setting in the industry. And then also we see professional sports, not only the leagues being some sort of monopoly in a sense, but they also, players individually in their contracts and how specific sports teams are able to lease major city stadiums all kind of fall into this kind of ownership of essential resources in terms of creating and maintaining a monopoly. And what we find out is that monopolists can also use pricing as another strategic barrier. Although this is very frowned upon, the Department of Justice tends to look at these types of predatory pricing instances and will essentially try to control this type of strategic barrier to enter. So essentially what you have happening here is you have selective price cutting or maybe advertising in some way. And so if you're able to maybe have some sort of monopoly in an industry, and one example that our book might refer to is Dentsply, and this is a manufacturer of false teeth. They essentially controlled about 70% of an existing market. And then through their kind of strategic pricing, they were found in 2005 to have essentially illegally prevented distributors from carrying competitive or competing brands. And this is very similar to the accusations that were placed on Microsoft, essentially through their whole antitrust case, where Microsoft essentially charged higher prices for its Windows operating system to computer manufacturers that featured competitors for Internet Explorer. So Microsoft would observe if Dell would have Netscape Navigator installed, and if they did, they would charge Dell a higher price. And so the U.S. courts ruled that this action was certainly illegal, and we tend to, again, see that this is fairly frowned upon. So as we move on through the monopolist origins, essentially when we're analyzing essentially monopoly demand, we have to come to a few assumptions first, is that the monopoly in some way is pure and that it is secured by patents or economies of scale or research ownership. We also have to believe that the firm is not regulated by any unit of government in any way. And then lastly, in our analysis, we want to assume the firm is a single price monopolist. It charges the same price for all units of output. And if this is the case, we can kind of use slide 4 as kind of our tools to developing this profit maximization. We are going to deviate from this a little bit later on and talk about how a monopolist can be a multi-price monopolist and what that essentially means. But from now on, those are our 3 assumptions, is that we essentially have to be a pure monopolist. So for us, we want to be a pure monopolist. We have to essentially, in order to be a pure monopolist, we have to have some sort of barrier to entry. We have to have no government regulation. And we also want to make sure that we are single price monopolist. So when we do that, what does that mean for us? Well, we can say then the demand curve has to be downward sloping in this market. And we know this kind of through our intuitive nature and exploration of the law of demand, in that we know that there's diminishing returns to utility, we know there's substitution effect, we know there's income effect. And what's really playing here in this downward sloping nature is that income effect. Although it might not be substitutable, we definitely know that the income effect will take control here. So again, the market demand is the firm demand, and the income effect is very strong here. So with that being said, how do we understand marginal revenue between for this profit maximization? Because again, we're going to understand and find out that even for a monopolist, we want to find where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. That's very, very important for us. Though for profit maximization, we need this condition to exist. So when we look at table 10.1, we see that there's maybe some quantity of yo-yos sold. We have the price of yo-yos, we have total revenue, and then we have some sort of marginal revenue change. And so we're able to calculate that. And we realize that once we analyze columns 2 and 4, we can see that marginal revenue in this instance is always below essentially what we have here. So when we look at marginal revenue outside of this first instance, we see that marginal revenue will always be less than demand. So for us, in our kind of graphical exploration, we already know if that we're facing a downward sloping demand curve, and if marginal revenue will always be below this, the marginal revenue must look something like this. And so kind of as we continue here, we can make that claim that marginal revenue is indeed less than price, especially after the first unit which is sold. Again, we believe that monopolists in this instance can be price makers, right? Because they are the industry. They have that pricing power and they're able to set the market price. And so the monopolist is going to essentially set the price in the elastic region of the demand curve. And we know that to be true because those are the higher prices. Monopolist tends to avoid setting price in that inelastic region because they want to be able to essentially charge a higher price for their good. They know that their product is fairly inelastic because of low substitutability. Therefore, they can get away with charging higher prices because we know it'll increase total revenue. So with profit maximization, how do we effectively go through this step by step? Again, the steps are fairly outlined here and I think are really important. Right? Step 1 tells us essentially that in order to look at determine the profit maximizing output, we need to find where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. That's extremely important for us. Step 2 then is going to look at essentially how we price because of this. So in order to determine the profit maximizing price, what we essentially do is create this vertical line upward from the output determined in step 1 to the pure monopolist demand curve. So again, if we're kind of side by side looking at this relationship, what we end up having here is essentially developing downward sloping demand, marginal revenue, So now we have some marginal cost. So again, we find that intersection where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Right? And so the idea is that's our quantity that will maximize profits. So Q star. So now the second step says we essentially extend this vertical line up to the demand curve. And then this becomes the price that the monopolist will charge. And that's very different from what we understood in a perfectly competitive market, right? Because if we're comparing here, our perfectly competitive market saw something like this. So if we had marginal revenue, marginal cost, this tended to be the quantity that we would saw in equilibrium, and price was already set for us. So we didn't have to worry about prices at all. So as we kind of move back towards the steps in the process, the next thing is understanding and determining the actual economic profit that we would observe. And so what we're going to essentially do is we're going to use either of these methods. So the first method says find profit per unit by subtracting the average total cost of the profit maximizing output from the profit maximizing price. Essentially, all that's saying here is looking at price minus average total cost. We already knew that, and then we're going to multiply the difference by any profit maximizing output, Q. This is already what we developed to be our economic profit analysis. So method one isn't necessarily new to us at all, and so we can generally just stay with this method. So as we move on then, and kind of see graphically what our interpretation is, we would realize essentially that this becomes where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue happens right here. So for profit maximizing monopoly, we're essentially going to supply at Q2 to the industry. We go up to point A, go over, and then this is our profit maximizing price. This is our profit maximizing quantity as indicated for our monopoly. Why is this true? Why don't we produce at Q1? Again, the reason is because at this point, marginal revenue on this side is greater than marginal cost. We know that we're better off if we were to produce an additional unit. And so why at Q3 don't we produce there? This is because that marginal cost is greater than marginal revenue, and therefore we realize that the benefits are not outweighed by the costs. So we want to stay at that point where marginal costs are essentially equal to marginal revenue. So to understand profits a little bit, let's kind of switch gears and have assume that we have a constant marginal cost curve. And so for us, if we assume this constant marginal cost curve, it's going to mean for us that in the long run, marginal cost and average cost curves are going to be one and the same. And for us, this is just a simplification to look at specific profit maximization instance. So how do we understand this? A profit maximizing monopolist, again, will produce where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. That happens here. So they go down to QM, right? And QM is then the profit maximizing level of quantity produced in the market. We go up to point A, go over to PM, and PM is our profit maximizing level for a monopolist price. So why is this important for us? Because now we're able to determine essentially the size of our profit. And so what we find out happening is that they will make a profit equal to the shaded area here, which is the PC to PM to A to C. And so the inefficiency of the monopoly will essentially be equal to the area bounded by ABC, which is essentially the difference between the area under the demand curve between QM and QC and the area under the marginal cost curve between QM and QC. So we have this loss occurring. Why do we know it's a loss? Well, we know that if we were to be optimal, optimality in terms of perfectly competitive instances would result in an output of B, or an outcome of point B, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And so that would occur at QC, and that would occur again at price PC. So for perfectly competitive firms, so perfectly competitive, price is PC, quantity is QC. So for a monopoly, price is PM, quantity is QM. And we can see that we're restricting quantity in our monopoly. And as a result, if we're restricting quantity, then that means that there's going to be these consumers in the market that are left out. So this tends to be, for us, we call it dead weight loss. Right? So we're not able to achieve any kind of welfare from this, and we're actually losing out on it from the optimal amount. So as we move on and we look to outside of our essentially comparison between perfectly competitive industry and the monopolist, we go back towards just sort of that kind of monopolist curve that we would, monopolist industry that we would be recognizing with this upward sloping marginal cost curve. So again, in order for us to profit maximize, we're going to essentially find this point C, go down to QM, go up to A, go over here to PM. Now we realize that PM is going to be the price in this market, quantity is going to be the quantity that the monopolies produce, and in effect we again realize and understand that QC would be the optimal level, and that PC would be the competitive firm's price as well. So we would want to be here, but we lose out then on all of this shaded region, A, B, and C. Right? Again, this is our dead weight loss in this instance. So in a competitive market, just to reiterate, the price will tend to be lower at PC, and the quantity produced tends to be greater than this monopolistic market. And that's where the pricing power comes into play, is that the monopolist can control quantity and therefore is able to essentially control price. And if we want a real world example of this, let's just think of the diamond industry and let's think of De Beers. Because they can control the amount of diamonds that enter the market, they're able to essentially have some sort of pricing power and able to raise prices. So we again have our dead weight loss shaded in red. And this is the inefficiency that is produced from the monopolist. So let's just assume that we can change our level of output here. Now, if we can change our level of output, why would we want to do this? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? And so in panel A, what we're essentially looking at here is if monopolists expand production from QM to QC, consumers essentially receive additional benefits, and these benefits are represented underneath the demand curve, and it's equal to the area bounded by QM, A, B, and QC. So these are the benefits that we see to the consumer. So all the way here, this green line tells us all of the benefits. But essentially, in order to achieve these benefits, they have to pay an additional amount equaling the area of QM, C, D, and CQ, right? So they pay this amount. So for leaving then for us, if they're paying this amount, right, and that's kind of within that marginal revenue curve, if they're paying this amount, then it has to be equal the net benefit to our outcome of essentially A, B, C, and D. So this ends up being all of the net benefit that we receive for consumers. So we can tell that consumers are better off here in this industry. So now let's look at panel B, and this is from the monopolist. So in order to expand production, the monopolist will incur additional production costs, and those are going to be equal to the area of QM, C, B, and QC. So these are the costs for essentially the firm to expand production, and that's represented underneath that our marginal cost or our supply curve for us. So if these are the additional costs, how much does it essentially gain in revenue Well, that's equal to the area of QM, C, D, and QC, again, over here. So they gain this additional area of revenue. And so we can see then essentially if the revenue in this instance is less than the additional cost, then it leaves a net loss for the firm. So the monopolist sees that there's a net loss to overproducing or producing at this level of output. So in order to expand production, the monopolist would essentially be hurt, although it'd help the consumer. And so a monopolist is profit driven. They're designed to essentially profit maximize. So we're not going to see any overproduction. We will always be producing less than that perfectly competitive amount. And so we want to switch gears here a little bit because all of this has been under the guise of a single price monopolist. So let's suppose then that this monopolist can price discriminate. Essentially, what that means for us is that this monopolist can charge different buyers different prices. There are going to be essentially price differences, but they generally are not assumed to be based on any cost differences. So if we define price discrimination, we say it is defined as charging different buyers different prices when such different prices are not justified by essentially the cost differences. So in order to have this, now this is a multi-price monopoly. In order to do this, first, clearly you have to have market power or some sort of monopoly power. It means that the firm must have some pricing ability. They need to be able to set prices, and that kind of is intuitive in this. The second two are kind of new to us. The next is market segregation. You need to be able to identify your different buyers. And not only that, you need to be able to identify and separate them based on their willingness to pay. And that's where it gets a little bit tougher. And thirdly, if you're able to kind of discriminate between markets, you need to be able to make sure that there's no resale. You can't have a lower priced buyer essentially arbitraging the good and selling it then at a higher price in the additional market. Otherwise, your price discrimination scheme would essentially break down. So we're going to focus our attention on industries that kind of exemplify this. And so one example, a little bit that we focus on to kind of understand this, is this kind of supermarket example. And this might seem trivial, but I think it's one that is really interesting. So what we're seeing here now is a firm essentially charging different prices per can of goods. So essentially what you have is an individual enters the market and they want to buy a can of beans. And so what they do is that we're going to find out that the monopolist charges the first can of beans. So for Q1, price is 30 cents. So then what the store does is say, okay, well, if you buy our second can of beans, right? So then for Q2, you only are going to be charged 25 cents, right? And this encourages buyers to consume the second can of beans. And then we say, listen, if you want to keep consuming for this third can, our price is going to essentially be 20 cents. So overall, essentially what this firm, let's say what this firm is making, their total revenue ends up being 75 cents for total revenue. Now this is very different than saying, well, let's charge you essentially an average price, right? Which we do see happening as well, but this is the difference here is on average, if you buy 3 cans, right, because this is our equilibrium, what we would see happening is 3 cans for 20 cents each, so that total revenue at 3 cans at 20 cents ends up being just 60 cents in total revenue. So what this supermarket is able to do is essentially segment the market into people who are going to buy one can of beans versus people who want to buy multiple cans of beans. And the pricing structure is such that essentially creates additional total revenue for essentially selling the same amount of cans in a very different way. So I think this was a really telling example. And so we're going to look at this a little bit more. In that we essentially think of perfect price discrimination now as an extension of the price discrimination analysis we just looked at. So let's assume, and this is kind of for exploration, that we can essentially know the exact willingness to pay. So under this assumption, we know exact willingness to pay. So for us, under this practice, we're selling it for the highest amount of price possible, right? You walk into a store, I know for the first can of beans, you're willing to pay $1. Well, I charge you $1, and if the second person walks into the store and their willingness to pay for a can of beans is 50 cents, I charge them 50 cents. And intuitively what happens here is it removes all consumer surplus and converts it to just producer surplus. So when we look at this graphically, essentially what happens is at every point here, we've converted all of it. So instead of having this for us, where this is profit and this is consumer surplus, and this is deadweight loss, what we end up doing is pricing up to the demand curve for every unit available. And if that's the case, we essentially are going to eliminate this deadweight loss, we're going to eliminate this consumer surplus, and we're going to make it so that all of this area is profit. And that's interesting. Firms want to be able to do this as much as possible if they could perfectly price discriminate, but clearly we can't. So how do we kind of, if this is the ultimate goal, how can we get closer to this? And so what we end up seeing is being able to charge a few different prices for different consumption levels or different market segments, kind of like our grocery store example. But here we're trying to base our segmentation differently. We might be basing it on location, right, or age, which we're going to see a lot. Income is really important, or maybe some identifiable characteristic that might be unrelated to cost differences. So who does this? Who are the industries that essentially take advantage of this? Well, clearly movie theaters, clearly airlines do, right? We know that movie theaters take advantage of this because they have different prices for students and adults. We also see that movie theaters essentially have different prices for matinee versus primetime showing. How do airlines essentially do this? Well, we know that airlines are able to segment their market by essentially leisure travel versus business travel. And as a result, we're able to see some sort of market segmentation developing there as well. So what does this look like if we were to analyze this in graphically? So we have two different markets. Market A tends to be, we can see that this is much more elastic in nature than in market B, which is much more inelastic. So maybe this is essentially for leisure travel, whereas market B might be for business travel. And this tends to make sense with our understanding of elastic versus inelastic. For leisure travel, this is fairly elastic because we would assume that there are many substitutes here, that if price changes too radically, we're able to substitute away here to some other leisure whereas the business side of travel is fairly inelastic. As prices deviate, you still need to go to your meetings. You will definitely cut down maybe on the amount of travel you do, but prices, as they fluctuate, won't necessarily deter too much changes in quantity. So in order to do this, a monopolist sees both of these markets, A and B. And what they do is they begin selling different prices. So again, we go to this idea where marginal revenue is going to be equal essentially to our marginal cost here. And so we know our marginal cost would be put into here, something like this. Because for the cost essentially to fly a leisure travel versus a business traveler is identical. There's no change in marginal cost. But because of the elasticity differences, we're able to essentially price differently as well. So we find where the price is in this market for the business travelers, what the quantity would be, and again, where the price would be for the leisure travelers and the quantity for the leisure travelers as well. And so we want to combine them for the monopolists. And so we essentially see if we're able to kind of pull this price over, what we end up seeing is that in just this, if we're looking at our marginal revenue curve, this part of the marginal revenue curve corresponds to just this part of the inelastic business travelers. Whereas then this marginal revenue curve is going to be the sum of this component and this component, right? And we can see that here. And so we don't have a demand curve in here because we're not concerned with that necessarily. All we want to know is the total amount of quantity in this market. And so essentially we're just going to be summing in individual markets the quantities, and this should get us our total monopolistic quantity. So where else might we see some of this? And we've talked a little bit about business travel already. We talked about movie theaters, but we can see essentially that we have maybe golf courses do the same thing. You have spring versus summer rates. You have early bird rates versus twilight rates. Electric utility does this as well with very specific generation issues under peak hours versus non-peak hours. Coupons, again, this goes back to the example that we talked about at the beginning. We could see this in some international trade aspects as well. So the able to essentially to segment our market is very important, and we're able to understand kind of that relationship to price discrimination then. So as we move on and switch gears one more time, we want to include now the thought of monopolies and regulation. So we're slowly eliminating the assumptions that we made at the beginning of this analysis so that we can kind of analyze them under kind of more real-world settings. So under monopolies and regulation, we observe and understand that natural monopolies should exist because of a variety of reasons, but more importantly, or the most important reason I should say, is that high fixed cost or economies of scale that comes out of this natural monopoly. So it now is incumbent on the government to determine how they should intervene, because we know that monopoly power results in adverse effects upon the economy. So we see this happen in a couple ways. The government usually intervenes when they feel that the monopoly should be a natural monopoly, or they feel that the monopoly is essentially abusing its monopoly power. So let's assume that the monopoly is observing this natural monopoly occur, the dilemma then for regulators is whether to choose the socially optimal price, what they might see under perfect competition, right? So this is where price is equal to marginal cost, or do they institute a fair return price where the price is equal to that average total cost? And we know if price is equal to average total cost, the firm would be making zero economic profit, but would be making positive accounting profit. We know from our analysis too, in comparison to that perfectly competitive industry, that price is equal to marginal cost is essentially our most efficient outcome. But in this instance, it could potentially result in losses for that monopoly firm right? At which point then the government would have to step in one more time and subsidize the firm for it to survive. So essentially pay the firm the difference in essentially their accounting profit. What we realize though is if we charge the firm essentially the price of average total cost, what we don't achieve is this allocative efficiency, meaning that we don't get to the total quantity in the market that is optimal for us. But we do ensure a fair return or some sort of, we call it maybe a normal profit for the firm. And so firms generally essentially push to receive this fair return price, and you'll see lobbying efforts happening in Washington to kind of navigate up to this fair return price. So what does this look like for us? And if we see this graphically then, we have these three different outcomes that we could achieve. So we have our downward sloping marginal revenue curve. We have our downward sloping marginal revenue curve here. Then we have our demand curve, our marginal cost curve, and then we have our average total cost curve. So why is this the socially optimal price? Well, essentially it's just because it's where marginal cost is equal to demand, right? So we find that this is socially optimal because marginal cost is equal to demand here. This then becomes our socially optimal or allocative efficient essentially outcome. So monopolists though could choose to essentially price here. And we know what that would happen. We would have this price for competitive firms, this price for monopolies. And so the government is trying to step away from this. So how do we include this fair return price? Well, again, we have to then look to the point for average total costs. And so what we end up getting is this quantity QF, which is in between the monopoly and the socially optimal, and we have this price for PF essentially here as well. And so at this average total cost, we would essentially be seeing no economic profit at all. And that's the idea, is that firms can achieve some sort of accounting profit, but we want to eliminate the economic profit they would be receiving. The other way that that the government can essentially intervene in the market is through essentially taxing monopolies. So after the fact, after the occurrence of the monopoly price and the monopoly regulation, what we end up doing is taxing the profits. What ends up happening is that we see no change in the distribution of resources after the fact. So we're already way below our perfectly competitive outcome. And just by taxing those accounting profits, what ends up happening is that we increase marginal costs here. And this increase in marginal costs will essentially be passed on through the consumer. And we can do this because of the inelastic nature of the firm's demand curve. So what does this look like? This is an extremely simplified version where we're just concerned with beginning where this marginal cost here. And so what we end up seeing is that this would be the price that we would charge at point B for the perfectly competitive outcome. So this would be QC. But the monopolist decides to charge essentially here at QM. And their price here is at PM1. And we know that because of the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal cost at point C. So now we institute a tax. So tax moves from MC1 to MC2. And again, this is just very simplified. And as we now move up, we find that our new point of profit maximization occurs here, where we have now QM1. And if we go up to prices, we see that prices PM2 are the prices that will be charged for this good because of this tax. So the government makes some money. They have some tax revenue that's occurring, but at the same time, consumers are now even worse off in this instance. So we tend not to tax monopoly profits, but tend to try and change the price before before the goods get to market. So the last little bit that we want to talk about here are more social constructs in terms of what constitutes maybe a good or a bad monopoly. Sometimes we might want a good or a bad monopoly to occur. And so the question that I ask here is, do we want a monopoly on maybe illegal drugs? So should we want one kingpin to run all of the underground illegal actions, but still maintain a monopoly, almost like if you guys have watched Breaking Bad, a Walter White type character? So why should we have a monopoly in that way? Well, essentially, maybe we'll reduce the amount of competition, right? Which in turn, in this environment, competition leads to violence, maybe lower product quality, which is even more dangerous. And so we might want to have, in this instance, for an illegal drug to have essentially a monopoly. In this case, it might be a good monopoly. And so I think these examples that we can portray here are important, especially when we're looking at it in an economic point of view, or if you're looking at it through a legislative point of view, and that maybe some of these should be explored on a case-by-case basis, and not necessarily throw a broad blanket over all monopolies. Another instance of this is essentially talking about Alcoa. So Alcoa was a aluminum provider, and so they had a monopoly over aluminum because they were the only ones to be able to essentially produce aluminum from the mines that they owned. And so the Department of Justice steps in and says, listen, Alcoa, we don't want you to be a monopoly anymore. And what ends up happening is Alcoa argues, and actually very successfully, they argue that, listen, we're not necessarily a monopoly in this instance because our competition deals with a variety of different resource elements. Not only are we competing in the primary aluminum construction and creation, but since aluminum is almost 100% recyclable, we're also competing essentially within this kind of secondary market of aluminum. And in that instance, our market share then of all aluminum produced and used is much, much lower. So although they were deemed a bad monopoly, so to speak, upon further investigation, they end up being kind of analyzed then as kind of a good monopoly, so to speak. So lastly, we want to talk about this, or what are some of the other kind of effects that a monopoly might have. And we know right away that there's some sort of income distribution or income transfer that occurs. So income distribution is more unequal than it would be under a more competitive situation. The effect of the monopoly power essentially is to transfer income from the consumer to the business owner. We saw that with any type of price discrimination or pricing power, reducing consumer surplus. So this will result in a redistribution of income in favor of business owners, unless the buyers of monopoly products essentially are wealthier than the monopoly owners, then we're not really worried in this instance. But generally, that's not the case. What other kind of cost implications can we see out of this? One, I think, is really important, and that's the economies of scale. And we know what this is already. And so we want to maybe, in some way, create or allow these economies of scale to develop so that we can have maybe some sort of greater specialization in that specific input. And allow firms to spread maybe the development costs over many, many units of output. And so one could easily make the case for Comcast or Time Warner Cable that these economies of scale are very important for their firms, and we should allow them to essentially remain a monopoly. The next, a little bit in terms of cost, is this idea of X inefficiency. Now, X inefficiency occurs because monopolists have no competitive pressure. They don't have to essentially produce at these minimum possible costs. And so they don't have this production efficiency occurring for them. And that's a shame. They're losing out in that way. But for monopolists, since there's no outside pressure to innovate or create any new technology, they can do this, and they can afford essentially to be inefficient. What we also see in terms of, for monopolists, in terms of additional cost, is this rent-seeking behavior. So monopolies essentially try to acquire or maintain some sort of government-granted monopoly privileges. And this is what we mean by rent-seeking, to maintain their monopoly. Sometimes this could be at substantially higher costs. Think about things like lobbying or legal fees, or maybe some public relations advertising, all of which ultimately are inefficient because these costs are essentially going to create and generate this monopoly. But if we were to allow competition to develop, we would be socially better off overall. And lastly, some of the costs that we see here is kind of this lack of technological progress and some sort of this lack of dynamic efficiency fails to essentially occur. The evidence here is mixed, though. Some monopolies have shown little interest in technological progress. One might argue electric generation and the infrastructure that we have is kind of limited in terms of the technological progress that we have, or that the electric generation utilities are very slow to innovate. On the other hand, though, research can also lead to lower unit costs, which help monopolies in the long run, essentially to lower any cost. And maybe they're allowed to do this because they're a natural monopoly and it makes sense to kind of recoup those economies of scale. Also, we see this occurring quite frequently is that certain research will help monopolies maintain its barrier to entry against new firms. And specifically, we always point to the pharmaceutical industry in being able to kind of create this advantage. So you have a drug, you put a lot of R&D into this, you get a patent, you sell it on the market. Now you have a certain amount of time where you're the sole producer, and those profits go into new technology and new research and development in order to essentially create the next generation of patents down the line. And so for us, this is it. This is all we want to talk about in terms of monopolies and its comparison to perfectly competitive industries. So if we're kind of wrapping up here, the things that I would be most important, that I think are the most important here for us, is to understand kind of how do monopolies exist. And we talked a variety of ways why that is. Two is then profit maximization for a monopoly. And so we kind of understand exactly how that occurs. The third is that we want to compare the monopoly to perfectly competitive firms. And we were able to do this in a variety of contexts, whether it be graphically, I think is very important, but also I think understanding the differences between prices and quantity are very important here. And so we want to move forward then after we compare to understand kind of then the deviations from our initial assumptions. And so that was essentially for us, we want to know how to price discriminate. And this price discrimination essentially says that we can charge multiple prices. We then want to say that there's some sort of government intervention. And I think that was important for us as well. And then we talk very lastly then about some of the effects that the monopoly has. So what are some of the effects that we see? And so we talk not only about income transfers, about cost complications, but essentially we're able to kind of roll back and look at some of the dead weight loss that occurs. And I think these are the most important elements of this chapter. So if you guys have questions, make sure that you think about them over the weekend, make sure that you are thinking about them in the future, and that you come to me with any questions that you might have here about this.